Greetings and bienvenue, Midnight Crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast, and welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
The creepiest thing I've ever seen happen to me as an adult, not as a child. I was born and raised in a little tiny mountain town in Northern California that no one has ever heard of, Pollock Pines, in 1966. My parents owned the only pharmacy there, and it was a great place to grow up. Times were different then. If your kids wanted to go out to play, you told them to be back by dinner. We were allowed to fish and explore in the woods, the whole bit. It was a great place to grow up. Heavily involved in the outdoors and the Boy Scouts Eagle, fourth one in my town. Whole summers spent on camp staff or backpacking with friends or with the Scouts. Not a stranger to the outdoors. I graduated high school in the next largest town over, Placerville, about a 20-minute drive on HI-50 in 1985, and joined the Navy. Have lots of adventures, see the world, see most of the country, yada yada yada, and get stationed in 1994 at Travis Air Force Base for a couple of years, which is cool because it's only 3 hours or so from home in my Scrambler. A couple of years previously, a chain pharmacy had moved into town, and my father, seeing the writing on the wall, sold his pharmacy stock to them, as well as taking a job as one of their pharmacists. A good move on the chain store's part. Small town of 3,000 people get protective of their people. Mom and Dad used the proceeds from the sale of the store to buy 40 acres in the middle of nowhere, no power, no phone, and a couple of unpermitted barns, one converted to housing. Nice land, has a seasonal creek, big catfish pond, all on the southern slope, really great piece of property. Bordered on 3 sides by National Forest, Sierra Nevada, and on one side by the local lumber company, which used to be Michigan, California, but is called something else now. Up north of the property are 2 popular fishing reservoirs, Ice House and Loon Lake, where water is made more accessible for Los Angeles and surrounding areas to steal. South of the property, the American River flows year-round, occasionally washing the highway out when it gets all antsy. My parents have big plans on making this their new home. They had lived in town, about a block away from the store they owned since '74. My dad's an outdoor buff, too, and my mom goes where my dad goes. They get good generators, put in a couple of propane tanks, and spend some weekends up there, but at this point in 1996, they're not living there yet. So, as both a great chance to get away from Fairfield, Travis Air Force Base, and as a favor to my parents, I'd go up on weekends. I didn't have duty and sort of watch the place. I did this pretty much every week for 2 years. I loved it. Bolt panning, shooting, a lot of maintenance and fire prevention, but really relaxing. Fun. I'd pick up my parents' dogs at the time, a Rottie and a Rottie Shepherd, Australian mix, and they'd go up with me. I'd get done doing whatever I was working on, and then take a walk around the property while there was still enough light to see. You were inside at night. It was black as pitch out there at night without moon or city lights. The walks were cool, and I got to test out a lot of my equipment. Went through phases where I was trying to determine what the best working, journeying sidearm was, and how to carry it. The best long gun and how to carry it. At one point, I liked the Winchester 94 seconds for the simplicity, but back then I could get a Garand for $295, so went with one of those for a while, with a bipod on the end to keep the barrel out of the mud when I was chainsawing or slinging brush. That got to be too heavy to carry, so I switched to a Mossy 590, which I eventually dropped for lack of long-range effectiveness. I was a sailor, not a soldier, don't make fun of me effectively, I was playing, and ended up eventually with an AR-15 HBAR that I'd picked up in OK while stationed at Tinker. I carried this African style, which is what the military taught me back when I had volunteered for security for a tour, and it only banged me up a little when I scrambled over the mountain. The night of this incident, I'd just finished doing whatever. I don't remember, but I was finishing the end of a walk around before I went in for the night to the lower barn that was sort of set up like a house. It was still light out, but not bright. It was that dusky sort of light that is sort of orange and gray, and while bright enough to see very clearly, it was obvious that it was going to be dark very soon, like in 10 minutes or so. Clear day, early summer, not too hot. Very light breeze, light clouds, the kind that are really pretty up in the mountains, and starting to turn orangey pink from the sun setting down the canyon. I'm walking the gravel road that comes from the top of the property where a great little artesian spring pumped out 5 gallons a minute or so in the upper barn, used for storage of Dad's equipment, tractors, etc. I'm just passing the pond, off to my left, carrying that slung African on my left shoulder, handguard in my left hand to keep it from smacking me as I walk. I've got a SP-101 in .357 in my right front pocket. My pants are a little damp from working, and I'm dirty, but happy. I loved being up there, as it got me away from my wife that hated the woods, and the weight of the sweat, plus the gun in my pocket tends to pull my pants annoyingly down every 40 steps or so. I stop where the gravel, mud road curves, and to where I can now clearly see the barn, house, and pull up my pants, making them more comfortable. I'm seeing the beautiful cloud patterns. The light breeze is feeling really good against my face. I'm pleasantly tired and looking forward to some cold fried chicken in the propane fridge, and I'm just really feeling calm and at peace. The dogs had been with me all day, and you know how dogs are, they explore. They were both tired, and the mix was actually leaning against me as I stood there after tugging up my pants, looking over this great scenery. The Roddy was laying splayed out on the gravel in front of me, and I'm just looking around me, marveling at how pretty everything was, checking out some old growth pine that had a really awesome looking granite boulder next to it. When the boulder stood up, turned around, and walked away. I swear to you, I'm not making this up. I was awake, wasn't thinking anything along the lines of creepy, and I'm in home geography. Whatever this thing was, had been obviously watching me, and when I looked right at it, it made the point of slowly turning around and walking away. No head, no limbs that I could see other than some sort of thick, trunk-like legs, and I couldn't tell you how I knew it was watching me without seeing eyes of any kind, let alone a head, but I swear it was. It waited until I was looking in its direction, and then whatever the hell it was turned around and walked away. It took its time, and was over the ridge line behind it and gone in about 8 or 10 seconds. It sauntered off slowly, sort of swaying. It didn't panic, or scatter, or bound off. It turned around and sauntered away. I stood there in shock. I was literally frozen. I don't want to say that I was scared, but I think I was, I don't know. It was still light, but now just dusky enough to where the shadows between the trees were dark black, and all I knew was that I wanted to be in. Inside somewhere with lights. I stood there, looking at the spot where this thing had walked off, and even though I had my hand on a loaded rifle with a full mag, I never even thought about using the gun. I just wanted to go, but I was afraid to move quickly. I don't know why. I think I cleared my throat or something, because it got Melly up, and she came over and nuzzled my hand for love. I said something along the lines of "Come on girls," and walked towards the barn, house, not looking anywhere else except the front door. I got in, shut the useless front door made almost completely up of glass, and locked it. Then put myself in a corner with 2 walls behind me. Inside walls, couldn't stand the thought of being against an outside wall, and called my parents on this huge-ass Motorola bag phone we shared back then. I kept the dogs with me, Mongrel in my lap. Actually, I really needed something living there with me, and tried to explain to my dad what I'd just seen. My dad's already been drinking by this time, and I didn't want him to come up, and I guess I'm trying not to look like such a coward because I'm a grown man of 30 or so, and eventually tell him I just wanted to let them know that I had gotten spooked by something I couldn't identify. He laughed at me, not meanly, and told me that I wouldn't be able to stay up there anymore if I freaked myself out, and I laughed it off with him because he was right, but I still slept downstairs in the big room that night, with propane lights on all night. If you want to call that sweaty, feverish, freaked out, never-ending time sleep. I was never in my whole life so glad to see the sunrise as I was that day. He and my mother came up the next morning, and we all went out to where I had seen whatever the hell it was. No tracks, nothing, and this thing was big. No hole where a boulder might have been, and neither of them ever remembered a rock being in that particular spot. I must have been hallucinating. It's the only thing that really makes sense, especially since neither one of the dogs that were with me lit up on this thing, and they lit up on everything, including rattlers. I've never hallucinated before, and I haven't since, but it's the only thing that makes sense. But I swear to you, and will swear to anybody, I saw what I saw. The part that really freaked me out about the whole thing was how I froze up. I didn't have to go for a gun, my hand was on a fully loaded round in the chamber, just click the damn safety off at R, and it never even crossed my mind to defend myself. All I could do was freeze. And to be honest, my nights in the woods aren't always as comfortable now as they used to be. I do get a bit weirded out sometimes. I never used to. Damn it. Parents still own the property, but don't live there. Just got too old for it. Mom is 80, Dad almost there, and still working. Mom never got creeped out up there. She was inside when it was dark, and went to sleep to save gas. She got up when it got light. Dad had to make the 30 or 40-minute one-way drive back and forth between work and the property, coming home late at night, and he's told me he's gotten weirded out up there before, but I don't know if he was just trying to make me feel better. I gave enough information out in this story so that anybody familiar with that area of the woods could almost figure out who I am. It really is a small town to this day.
I have a couple of stories. Here's one. Every year we go hunting up in Millerville, Alabama, where my in-laws have a cabin. I come from New Hampshire and spent most of my time outdoors in the woods growing up and don't scare easily. I don't know what it is, but those early morning and after dark walks to and from the hunting stands in the Alabama woods spook the shit out of me. There is something different about the woods there I can't put my finger on. I just kind of always felt uneasy. So this one area we hunt has an old abandoned house on it. My brother-in-law told me that it was the old Alexander place. He said when he was very little he remembered going there with his dad. I guess they all got to drinking, and old man Alexander pulled out a gun and just shot himself through his foot for no damn reason, other than he was batshit crazy, I guess. My father-in-law, and he got the hell out of there, and on my first trip hunting up there he showed me the hole in the floor. I guess about 15 or so years later, old man Alexander dies. His kids didn't want anything to do with him, so he died out there all alone. They didn't find him for a couple months. He got dressed in his Sunday best, laid down on his bed and pulled the trigger. So one year, after I got out of my stand from my morning hunt, I decided to make a pit stop over at the old Alexander place. The trail to my stand runs along a creek bottom and is about 3 miles from the hardtop. About 2 miles from the hardtop on this same trail is the intersection that leads to Alexander's place. It goes for a good mile and is overgrown like a bastard, just enough room to get through with my Honda. I start creeping down there and the house comes into view. Now it's been about 5 or 6 years since I'd been there and the place was decaying fast. I forgot how spooky it was down there. The place is in the bottom of a hollow, all overgrown and dark as hell. The house was covered in kudzu and a big tree had fallen and caved in a large portion of the roof. I shut off my four-wheeler and right away I'm freaked out by the complete and total lack of noise. No birds or chipmunks, nothing, not a sound. I get to the front door and open it up. The floor is covered in leaves and pine needles from the hole in the roof. It's dark, dank and musty and smells a little of rotting flesh. I reason to myself that there's probably a dead dog under the house or something. The house is pretty small with one room for the kitchen and living room and a single bedroom and bath off to one side. Now at this point my mind is telling me to get the hell out of there, but my sense of exploration won't listen to reason. I start poking around and I'm amazed because everything seemed to be just as old man Alexander left it. Granted, he'd been gone many years and things were rotting away, but it looked like it hadn't been touched. I guess his kids, or anyone for that matter, hadn't been out there in a very long time. Now you have to understand something about me. I've been an antique collector for years, and in particular I collect old pictures and period frames. As I look around me I see beautiful old family pictures set in very ornate original wooden frames. 3 of them are in the bedroom and in perfect condition, the others are in the living room where the tree crashed through the roof with portraits ruined but frames intact for the most part. So for the next hour I start digging through paperwork, reading letters, looking in closets and such. I'm totally engrossed and almost unaware of everything around me. I end up in the bedroom and look under the bed and pull out an old box of letters old man Alexander wrote to his wife during the war. So I sit down on the old mattress and start reading for about a half an hour, I guess. I'm halfway through this one letter and bang. This huge gun report goes off like it's right in the room with me. I could even feel the concision, it was so close. Now if anyone has ever felt the effects of a gunshot in a house knows there's a big difference between in the house and right outside the house. This was in the house and felt like in the bedroom I was in. I pretty much froze for a couple seconds and slightly pissed myself. At first I didn't know if it was my brother-in-law messing with me or some crazy mountain man shooting. My rifle was on my four-wheeler outside, so if this was the case I was screwed. I took a decisive course of action and ran like a bitch out of there, jumped on my Honda and white-knuckled that sucker all the way back to the cabin. I got there and met all the guys and told them the whole story. So of course they immediately wanted to go back there and check it out. We all drove back out there and had a good look around. There was nothing to be seen anywhere. I went back inside with my brother-in-law. As we were standing in the bedroom, he said it was probably the ghost of old man Alexander as he shot and took his life. So I ended up taking all the pictures with me. I refinished 5 of them and put old family pictures of my own in them and hung them on the walls of our farmhouse. I didn't destroy any of the original Alexander portraits out of respect and store them in my den. The last portrait is of old man Alexander himself, in an ornate convex glass frame and hangs intact in my foyer. May sound kind of creepy to you, but it felt right to me. I think he may approve as well. I haven't been back there since that day, and I never will, but every time I get out of my stand after dark and ride my four-wheeler past the Alexander intersection, I put the high beams on and pin it all the way back to the cabin.
As a kid, I lived with my grandparents for a while. My grandfather was not a friendly guy. He was a World War II vet who then enlisted in the Air Force after returning from the Pacific. He didn't come home to his family for several years. Family lore was that the war had messed him up in the head, or that he was injured badly, and he needed time to heal before coming home. He was always saying that the end of the world as we know it was right around the corner with all the recent wars in the Mideast, gasoline ration, Watergate, the Kennedys, etc. He didn't trust anyone, and was sure the banks were going to fail, Russians were going to invade, race riots were coming again, it changed weekly. He always warned me that they would be trying to come and get our stuff someday soon, so we had to be ready. We had shelves of food, water, generators, fuel, gold bars, buried firearms, and ammo. The usual. I was 9 or 10 at the time, and this would have been about 1972 or 73. We were living in a small cabin on a ridge looking over the Maumee River in northeast Ohio for the summer. This was his weekend getaway primarily. There were very few neighbors for miles, and the ones that were nearby were mostly weekenders. The nearest small town was about 10 miles away, and the hospitals were even further away as I recall. There is a 2-lane 55 miles per hour highway that's on the opposite side of the cabin, that has nice views of the river that was pretty much a straight road with slow curves every 10 miles or so. About a half mile down the road though, there was a crazy sharp curve that terminated at a small bridge over a creek. There were several accidents there every year, some with fatal injuries. We would often hear the crashes. Sometimes I would wander down there the next morning to look at the scene and stuff and wonder if the drivers were okay. One warm summer night we were awakened by a pounding on the front door. My room was right next to the door, and my grandfather was down the hallway a bit. I remember getting out of bed and having him hand me a shotgun, while he held a 1911 as he looked through the window to see who it was. I had never recalled anyone ever stopping by before, especially in the middle of the night. The cabin was elevated with a storm, shit hits the fan shelter underneath, so there were 4 steps leading up to the door. We had one of those old yellow sodium security lights in the yard, and things always looked kind of hazy and weird at night. I looked out the window next to him and saw a man and a woman on the lower step to the door. They must have knocked and then stepped back down. He opened the door a bit, all while keeping his pistol pointed at them, and the woman exploded in a crying, blabbering, screaming wail all at once. She said that there was a terrible accident that just happened down at the curve, and could we please call an ambulance? There were other people hurt, and they needed help, and could we come to help them too? Now, this man hated hippies more than anyone else, and these two might just have qualified. She had on ripped jeans, one of those suede leather fringe jackets, and the guy looked like he had a biker vest on. She did have what looked like blood in her hair, and was not making much sense at all. What was really weird was the guy wasn't saying anything, he was just standing off the porch listening to her go off. I assumed he was intimidated by the .45 pointing at him, and didn't want to antagonize the old man with the crew cut holding it. My grandfather was sure they were stoned, and kept telling the girl to calm down, but she wouldn't, and they got into a screaming match between them, ending with him telling her to get the hell off his property or he would shoot them both. We were both outside watching them head back to the road, and I noticed the guy wasn't even wearing any shoes. As I didn't hear a crash, and they were so weird, I didn't know what to think. We went back inside, and my grandfather sat me down and explained his theory to me. They were making the story up. They were most likely drug addicts who were looking for some poor suckers to rob, or maybe kill. I recall the Manson story held my grandfather's interest for some time. I asked him what about the blood in her hair, and he stated it was fake, trying to gain our trust, and entrance into our cabin. I thought we could just call the state police to be safe, but he wasn't fond of inviting cops into his world either, so we just went back to bed. As soon as I woke up I was still curious, but didn't walk down to the bridge on the curve. Later in the morning, several police cars and pickups began arriving and parking off to the side of the road down there, and I couldn't resist going down to check it out. My grandmother went with me, as my grandfather was still at work. An ambulance was departing as we arrived at the location. We soon saw the evidence of an accident the previous evening. There was a smashed guardrail, bits of metal, glass, and a tree off the road with a deep gouge, and a bunch of bark missing. A mangled motorcycle was down in the ditch, and several people were searching around in the heavily wooded creek area. We overheard that at least one man was dead, and his girlfriend was found a half-mile down the road in really bad shape, and was in critical condition after being found by a passing motorist. It was a single motorcycle that had lost control as far as I understood it. One woman was sobbing to one of the troopers asking them if they had found the boots yet. Her son was the motorcyclist who wrecked, and I guess the impact threw him out of the new boots she said had just purchased. She also said he didn't ever wear a helmet, and she wished he would have. The cop, trying to console her, told her he didn't suffer as he was almost assuredly killed instantly when he hit the tree. I tell you, I think my heart nearly jumped out of my chest, and I have never felt so cold in my life when I started connecting the dots. We walked back home without giving any of the people there any information. I don't remember even speaking to any of them, but I was in a daze. I was freaked out for days. I was feeling very guilty about the girl and the ghost. Well, I didn't even want to think about him. And who the hell did the girl want us to go help? I heard my grandparents discussing it only once, later that night, and coming up with a story to help them sleep at night. They decided the guy wasn't killed in the crash, he died later. Mostly from all the drugs that he and his girlfriend were all hopped up on, and that the girl was just fine. We never mentioned it again, but we didn't spend as much time there as we had before.
This happened about 20 years ago. I was 25 and camped out a lot at Lake Texoma. In case anyone knows the area, I camped off of Brushy Creek near the Hagerman Wildlife Refuge. The area was secluded and wasn't an official campground area. I had been there several times, and this is the only time anything unusual happened. I was with a friend of mine who used to go with me. He never went again after this trip. We set up our tent in a small clearing about 50 yards from the water. After dark we decided to fish from the bank. As we were walking down to the water, we passed a thick group of trees and brush. Something growled as we passed. It was a low guttural-sounding growl that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I've been camping and hunting my entire life and am completely comfortable in the woods. I have seen and heard every type of animal native to Texas and have even been chased by a bear in Colorado. I have never heard a growl like that before or since. We both shine our lights into the tree line, but we didn't see anything else. Neither one of us were too eager to investigate further, so we gave the trees and brush a wide berth and went on down to the water. We didn't experience anything else until later. Later we went to the tent to go to sleep. We had just settled down inside when it started. Something was walking around through the brush and trees around the tent. I could tell it was on two legs and sounded big. I assumed at the time it must be a person who had wandered up on our campsite. I was concerned they were going to steal some of my gear that was outside the tent. I grabbed an old hunting shotgun I had with me and told my buddy to grab a light. At this point he refused to get out of the tent. I got out, shined the light around, and didn't see or hear anything, so I went back to the tent. The walking soon started again, so I repeatedly went out with the light and gun. After 2 more times of this, I went out and gave the "I have a gun" speech, hoping if it was a person I would scare them off. At this point I was freaked out and was almost willing to just start shooting into the tree line. I went back into the tent and didn't go back out. Whatever or whoever it was continued to circle the tent until daylight. Needless to say, neither of us got any sleep. When the sun came up I checked the campsite. No gear had been stolen, and I had some expensive stuff such as a propane stove, etc. We checked for tracks, but it was falling and leaves were everywhere. You could see places where it was obvious that something had been moving around, but nothing to identify what it was. I checked out a site called Bigfoot Field Researchers Organization that keeps track of Bigfoot sightings, and there are several listed for Lake Texoma and a couple for almost the same spot I was. I'm not saying Bigfoot visited my camp, but I won't take my family there. My son thinks the story is cool, and he wants to go there, but I won't take him. After that trip, I always have either an AR or an AK with me when I'm in the woods.
In my early 20s, I went through a wandering stage. I had just graduated from college and couldn't find a job anywhere. Rather than go a couple $100s into the hole every month paying for rent while searching for a job, I decided to pack up what few belongings I owned and head out to see the country. This is something I can't recommend enough. Stay off the interstates, hop a train from time to time, and hitchhike with no particular destination in mind. It was this kind of aimless wandering that led me to the Pine Barrens of New Jersey. If you've never experienced them, the Barrens are an amazing place. Huge stands of oak and evergreen trees, many older than time itself, grow out of that strange, sickly soil. Sugar sand, the locals call it. In the rainy season it forms quicksand, and in the dry season it can still swallow farm machinery whole. Of the few farms I saw out there, all looked like they had seen better times, and many looked like they had sat untouched for decades. Yet there was something alluring about the place, a sort of ancient secret I was afforded glimpses of in the shadows when the wind stirred the tree. The sort of movement at the edge of your vision that follows you throughout the day, but disappears as soon as you turn your head. From time to time as I hiked down old dusty roads, an old pickup truck or rusted-out car would bound over a hill toward me. Most times the driver would eye me suspiciously and speed up as they approached. Occasionally the driver would stop to talk to me for a few minutes.
What are you doing out here?
One old toothless man clad in overalls asked me, wandering around, seeing what there is to see. The old man spat a putrid brown stream into the dust.
Tain't nothing to see around here. Least nothing you want to be seeing.
When I asked the old man what that meant, he made a guttural, throaty sound. I wasn't sure if he was choking on his tobacco or bothered by the question. But he didn't answer. He offered me a ride in his pickup the way I had come back into town, but when I declined he spat in the dirt again and sped off, shaking his head. My eventual plan was to make it to Delaware sometime that summer and meet up with some extended family there, but I was in no hurry. In truth, I had been in heaven these last few weeks, taking my time heading south and exploring anything that caught my eye. I had explored every abandoned building and every cave I had seen. I had half my weight in power bars in my pack. But over the last 2 months I had honed my skills at trapping rabbits and gathering wild edibles, sitting up late at night beside my campfire, and sleeping beneath the stars. The night sky in an area so devoid of human influence is beyond comparison. But tonight there were clouds moving in, and the sun was disappearing faster than I had grown accustomed to. When the deep roar of thunder shook the valley, I knew I had better find shelter. In the failing sunlight I could see in the distance some structures at the top of a hill. I ran the half-mile distance and was disappointed to see that the ancient house and barn were in terrible shape. The roof of the barn had completely collapsed, and the upper 2 floors of the 3-story house had collapsed into a mangle of ancient wood. Still, the house was my best option, so I made my way toward it as the heavens began to open up. As I'd seen on other properties in the area, this house had a small cemetery in the yard. I ran toward the gaping front door of the dilapidated house, carefully making my way between the headstones. When lightning flashed, I was able to make out the name Kalakak on several of the headstones which the elements hadn't completely erased. When I got inside, the floor was spongy but felt solid enough to hold my weight. I took off my pack and set it near the door, caught my breath, and had a look around. The hinges of the front door had long since rusted away, but I was able to fit the door back into the opening enough to hopefully keep the wind and rain out. At one end of the room, there was a stone fireplace and chimney which was solidly constructed, but I had no wood for a fire. Next to the fireplace was a stairwell, full of rubble and cobwebs. I didn't dare apply my weight to those steps as many had rotted to nothing under their own pitiful weight. Opposite the front door was an opening to an old kitchen of sorts, but when I tried to approach it my foot went clean through the floor and I decided to stay put until the storm blew itself out. The remains of the upper floor did an adequate job of keeping the ground floor dry, and I was able to arrange my sleeping bag so that very little water draining from the upper floors managed to land on it. I got out my harmonica and played for a few minutes, then stopped, apprehensive. I didn't know what I was afraid of, but something had chilled me to my core. Outside, the storm continued to build in intensity. My eyes were focused on that stairwell, seeing nothing in darkness and flash-blinded when lightning struck. I must have fallen asleep at some point, because suddenly I came in with a searing pain in my neck from leaning my head against the wall for so long. Outside, the storm continued to pound down its fury upon the earth. As I sat there rubbing my neck, I began to chuckle at myself for getting wrapped up in the superstition of the area when I heard it. At first I heard indiscriminate movement upstairs, in the ruins of the upper 2 floors. I was just about to write it off as rats when it suddenly stopped. I froze in place, daring only to move my eyes, and even then just barely. After 30 seconds of paralytic fear, I smiled at myself again and was just about to settle into my sleeping bag when I looked toward the stairs. At the top of the doorway were a pair of glowing red orbs, staring at me. Very slowly they closed down to horizontal slits, then opened up again, wider than before. I can't tell you how long I sat there, staring at it, staring at me. It could have been seconds or hours. Eventually, my lower-level self-preservation skills began to kick in, and subconsciously I started reaching for the knife on my belt. Our eyes locked. My hand progressed inch by inch toward my only means of defending myself. Neither of us blinked for what felt like hours, while the storm raged on. I prayed for another lightning strike, so that I might catch even a glimpse of my adversary, but despite the ferocity of the rain, the darkness was absolute. When at last my hand reassuringly touched the hilt of my knife, it seemed as if the very fabric of existence was ripped to shreds. The creature began bellowing in the most unearthly, mind-numbing shriek I have ever heard. Knowing I had only one chance, in one fluid motion I released the snap that held my knife in place and released an inside-overhand throw I had practiced during years of misspent adolescence. I heard a sickening wet thunk and the shrieking increased in volume 100-fold. As I smashed the rotten door to pieces, I heard the creature flapping against the wall and screaming. Just as I wrenched the remains of the door open, a great flash of lightning struck, and all around the house I saw piles of bones, feathers, and fur. I ran as I had never run before or since. I ran until my veins pumped acid and my limbs were stone. I couldn't see where I was going, but I could follow the dirt road by the sounds of the sugar sand slurping roadside debris in the ditches. I didn't dare look over my shoulder. When the sun finally rose, I collapsed in the road, heaving, oblivious to the downpour. I awoke with a start to the sound of a car horn blaring inches from my head. I leapt to my feet and spun around to see the old man from yesterday, holding his sides with laughter. When I opened my mouth to speak, he motioned with his thumb to the back of his truck. I climbed without a word and he began to drive. The events of the previous night began to replay themselves in my head. What in the hell had happened? No matter how many times I considered what I saw, none of it made any sense. As we drove, I realized how far I had run in the dark. It must have been nearly 10 miles. I was angry with myself for being so terrified by a dream. That's the only thing it could have been. Approached from this angle, everything fit into place. I'd experienced a false awakening, as I had so many times in the past when experimenting with dream herbs. I had a nightmare and woke up with adrenaline pumping and abandoned all of my gear in an old house. I suddenly realized that the truck had sat motionless for quite some time and the old man was turned around in his seat staring at me. I looked up at him and he grinned. With sickening horror, I realized that we were at the bottom of the hill on which that wretched house sat. I jumped out of the pickup and thanked the old man, who drove off. I slowly walked up the muddy path that led to the house, composing myself. When I reached the yard, I saw the old piles of bones which had shocked me the previous night during the storm. Of course, there were coyotes and foxes in the area, and I had hunted a couple of wild turkeys. The critters probably had their dens around here and had been using the house as a windbreak. Inside the house, everything appeared as I had left it. My sleeping bag, my pack, and my harmonica were sitting on the floor, and I could see my knife sticking out of the wall across the room. I packed everything up and put on my backpack, then walked over to the stairs and pulled my knife out of the wall. I was about to return it to the sheath on my belt when I looked at the blade and noticed the dried-on blood and the clump of oily black hair stuck in it.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel, as more Greentexts will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.
Remember to check out the Odyssey page in the description for a second archive of the channel's videos.